Gravel shifted under boots as the range woke before sunrise at Fort Ridgeline, Colorado, breath drifting into the cold air as thin clouds of pale fog. Red-lensed headlamps flickered like faraway stars, while steel targets waited motionless downrange, barely shapes against the dark earth. Rifles sat in their cases, heavy and silent, ready for a day meant to decide who truly belonged. One male candidate paused at the roster, sliding a finger along the list until he found her name, his mouth twisting into a crooked smirk as he leaned toward another man and muttered, "Didn't she wash out last time?" The reply wasn't laughter, just a low, cutting noise that slipped through the line and landed exactly where it could hurt most, though she never lifted her eyes. She knelt beside her rifle case, checking the latches twice, then once more, slow and exact, as if her whole world was contained in the gear under her hands. An instructor's stare hung on her for a brief moment, unreadable, then moved on like she was already a problem better left alone. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Old Bill's Tales so you never miss these true stories of courage. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. Her name was Staff Sergeant Mara Kincaid. She was 28, an infantry squad leader in the United States Army, and she stood on that firing line with the same steady posture she used in front of her soldiers back home, shoulders squared, chin level. Weight settled like responsibility lived in her bones instead of fear. This chance hadn't appeared out of nowhere. The sniper course had hovered on her horizon for years, requested, denied, requested again, delayed by deployments and unit demands, until finally approved at the exact moment she had stopped hoping for it. When the orders came, she didn't celebrate. She folded the paper once, tucked it away, and returned to work like the real test had already begun. To most of the candidates around her, she didn't look like any kind of threat. She was smaller than most of the men on the line, not delicate, just compact, built for endurance rather than intimidation. When she spoke, which wasn't often, her voice stayed calm and even, never rising to compete with the loud personalities filling the cold morning with bravado. She kept to herself while others clustered together, laughing too loudly, too easily. Mara hovered just outside the noise, checking gear, adjusting straps, her gaze drifting from face to face in quiet assessment. That stillness only fueled doubts. To people who needed noise to feel strong, silence looked like weakness. And then there was the story that clung to her name, the one always whispered by someone who swore they remembered it. She'd been rejected before, they said, like a stain no one could scrub away. Same course, same place. A quiet failure that never needed details to keep its edge sharp. 6 years earlier, she had stood on another range as Specialist Mara Kincaid, younger, quicker to prove herself, and far less patient. She'd shown up with pride too close to the surface, convinced that effort alone would carry her through. The course dismantled that belief piece by piece. Her failure came during a graded range estimation event under pressure. The clock hammered in her ears, instructors seemed too close, and then the radio crackled with news she was never meant to hear. Her mentor from her home unit had been wounded overseas, hit by an improvised explosive device that left him alive but broken. Her focus cracked for only a heartbeat, but a heartbeat was all the course ever needed. Her numbers drifted offline, her solution slipped, and by the time she turned in her card, she already understood the outcome. The cadre didn't yell and didn't debate it. One simply looked at her, worn out and direct, and said, "Not ready." She was dismissed without ceremony. No speech, no comfort. Just the heavy truth that she had failed herself at the very moment she believed she couldn't afford to. She packed her gear quietly and walked away, convinced she might never set foot there again. What came next wasn't dramatic. It was steady, quiet work. She returned to her line unit, asking for nothing extra. She took point when it was her turn, followed when it wasn't, and stopped talking about goals altogether, turning her attention to the details that actually mattered. At night, while others slept, she pored over wind charts and ballistic tables until the numbers felt like instinct. She learned to read mirage the way farmers read the sky. She sought out older marksmen, men who no longer bragged because life had already humbled them, and asked them to teach her what they wished they'd known sooner. Whenever extra range time came up and everyone else passed because it cut into rest days, she took it. When drills dragged on and people complained, she stayed locked in. Urgency gave way to humility. Frustration shifted into discipline. She discovered that patience wasn't about waiting at all. It was about preparation. Small habits followed her everywhere, the kind only careful observers ever noticed. Her left hand drifted to the spot where a wedding ring might have rested, thumb brushing the faint groove on her skin, though she wore no band. When she adjusted her sling, she tightened one specific buckle until it sat perfectly flat. Not for comfort, but because uneven pressure irritated her focus. Even under stress, her voice stayed low and controlled. She never rushed to fill silence. She listened longer than she spoke, and when she did speak, it was usually to correct something, not to draw attention. Around her, the social lines were already drawn. Master Sergeant Logan Hartley moved through the candidates with the expression of someone who had witnessed every flavor of confidence and collapse this course could manufacture. He wasted no breath and even less patience, delivering instructions like he was reporting facts, not offering encouragement. Sergeant Dylan Rourke sat at the opposite end of that spectrum. Loud, talented, eager to measure himself against others, and even quicker to dismiss whatever didn't fit his worldview. Mara's calm unsettled him in ways he couldn't articulate, and that discomfort leaked out as sharp remarks and casual doubt. Specialist Evan Solis watched Mara from a different angle. Younger, unsure of himself, he studied her the way someone drowning watches a person who knows how to float. He didn't step in to defend her, but his gaze stayed locked on her movements, as if he was trying to absorb whatever kept her so composed. Corporal Liam Harrow stood slightly apart from the others, the British Army exchange candidate carrying himself with a quiet, disciplined restraint. He didn't participate in the mockery, but he didn't shut it down either, choosing instead to keep his eyes low and his professionalism neatly in place. When the order to move out rolled down the line, Mara dropped to one knee and flipped open a small field notebook, writing a single precise line before tucking it back into her pocket. When she rose, her stance didn't shift at all. It wasn't a hope. It was a commitment she fully intended to honor. The Day 1 briefing hall carried the scent of old plywood, burned coffee, and damp uniforms trying to dry in the stale air. Candidates squeezed into folding chairs, knees bumping, notebooks ready, each trying to appear prepared, even as nerves buzzed quietly through the room. Master Sergeant Logan Hartley stepped forward, hands behind his back, surveying them like he was already sorting through a list of problems. His tone stayed flat, almost uninterested, which somehow made the warning sharper. Most of them would fail, and he said it like he was giving a weather report. Failure wouldn't be dramatic, he added. No explosion, no spectacle. Just a simple, quiet removal. Your name crossed out, and your pride left behind. When he mentioned washouts, Sergeant Dylan Rourke shifted in his seat, cutting a quick glance toward Mara, his jaw tightening as if Hartley had just confirmed his favorite rumor. Outside, The first real test hit them before confidence had a chance to form. A timed ruck march shoved them into a cutting wind that sliced straight through their uniforms. Everything shrank to boots hitting earth, breath burning in the cold, and the steady drag of weight on their shoulders. Mara held a middle position, not charging ahead, not falling behind, moving with the smooth efficiency of someone who understood that panic only wasted energy. Her shoulders stayed level. Her pace never wavered. She passed one man who had sprinted early and was now paying for it, gasping and trembling. Rourke drifted toward her deliberately, matching her stride long enough to make the moment feel like a provocation. He eyed her boots, then her face, and said loudly enough for others to catch, "That's that admin strong pace right there." A couple of men chuckled, the kind of laugh that came easy when the target wasn't them. Mara didn't take the bait. She kept her gaze straight ahead and let the wind carry the remark away. Comfort didn't last long here. The stalking lane practice kicked off under a heavy gray sky, the ground soaked from earlier rain. Candidates belly-crawled through wet grass and sand, elbows digging in as grit worked into every seam of their uniforms. Their hearts pounded hard in their ears, and every shift of weight seemed loud enough to betray them. Most tried to rush. They pushed for speed, and speed punished them. A head lifted too high. A knee popped up. Grass twitched where it shouldn't. Spotters caught them instantly, calling them out with sharp, effortless precision. Mara didn't fall into that trap. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if time was something she could negotiate with rather than fear. She flowed across the ground, as if the earth knew her, slipping into shadows, pausing whenever the wind shifted, waiting patiently for a spotter's focus to drift. She didn't battle the terrain, she let it guide her. From a raised platform, a spotter leaned toward another and whispered, surprised, "How is she that quiet?" The words weren't meant for the candidates, but they carried anyway. A few heads turned. A few half-formed jokes died before they could leave anyone's throat. Then came the range estimation drills, the kind designed to slice through ego and punish anyone who guessed instead of thinking. Steel targets dotted the open landscape, each distance set to trick the eye. Heat shimmered, mirage twisted the view, and reality bent just enough to make confident shooters look foolish. Rourke wanted an audience. He pointed out a distant target and called, "Hey, Kincaid, call that one. Let's hear it." His tone curled into a smile that wasn't friendly, more like he was waiting for her to stumble so he could feed off it. Cards dropped to laps as others looked up, curious, eager to watch someone else fail. Mara didn't take the bait. She wrote her estimate quietly, then studied the mirage again, watching how it drifted and thickened, how the air seemed to breathe. She made a slight correction and handed her number over with the same calm she carried everywhere. Hartley scanned her card, said nothing, and moved on. No praise, no criticism, and in that room, that silence spoke louder than approval. Rourke watched the instructor's back as if he wanted to protest, then scoffed and pretended none of it mattered. The jab that hit hardest came later, in the chow line, when exhaustion made tempers short and insecurities sharp. Metal trays slammed, the smell of overcooked meat hung thick, and conversations hummed low, shaped by a day that had already humbled them all. A candidate she barely knew edged close enough to speak and said, "You washed out once. What makes you think you belong here now?" It wasn't shouted. Worse, it was delivered like an accepted truth. Silence rippled down the line, slow and heavy, as everyone waited to see how she'd take the hit. Even the men who mocked her earlier stopped eating, Even Rourke turned, hungry for a scene. Mara kept her tray steady. Her hands didn't tremble. She looked at the man, not with anger, but with a calm that refused to rise to his level. "I'm here because my unit needs me ready," she said. Nothing more. No justification. No story. Just duty placed between them like a shield. What would you have done with a whole room watching your past like it was a verdict? Nightland navigation followed, and the course began stripping away the kind of confidence that only survives in sunlight. The forest swallowed sound. The air chilled as darkness settled, and their headlamps carved narrow circles of light that felt too fragile against the night. Whispers drifted around them as they stepped off. Rumors about who was already falling behind, who was lost, who was quietly cracking under pressure. Someone muttered that the course was designed to humiliate. Someone else claimed it was built to reveal. Mara moved steadily, pacing like it was a heartbeat she could trust. She checked the terrain against her map, matching tree lines to contour lines, refusing to let the ticking clock push her into mistakes. Once, she stopped completely, listening to the wind moving through the branches before shifting her azimuth a few degrees, almost like she was nudging the world back into alignment. She reached the control point with only seconds left. Mud streaked across her knees, and her breathing steady and controlled. She handed over her card without seeking approval. Hartley accepted it with the same flat expression he gave everyone, though his eyes lingered on her just a moment longer. Rourke showed up late, storming in with anger masking panic, blaming the course, the terrain, the darkness, anything but himself. He spoke loud enough for others to hear, using noise to hide the sting of failure, and some candidates nodded along because blaming is contagious when fear starts spreading. The next morning, the pressure cinched tighter. Hartley announced that the graded unknown distance range would kick off earlier than planned. The news struck the group like icy water. Unknown distance meant no hiding behind memorized figures or familiar lanes. It demanded a mind steady enough to resist pride's urge to rush. Rumors sparked instantly because fear always needs fuel. "She's going to fail again," someone whispered. The words carried that familiar edge, the same hook they'd used last time. A few tried to laugh, but the sound came out thin, fading into uneasy silence as even those rooting for her failure began to wonder what it would mean if she proved them wrong. Would you have stayed quiet or spoken up if you saw the room turning against her? That night, while the barracks sagged into exhausted stillness, Mara stayed awake a little longer. Under a weak light that made everything look worn, she laid out her rifle parts with quiet precision. Her cleaning cloth moved in slow circles, oil briefly flashing on metal before sinking in. Even with fatigue tugging at her eyes and jaw, her hands never faltered. She held her posture like it mattered, because to her, it did. When she closed the case, the latches clicked shut with the same calm finality as her own breathing, and suddenly the space around her felt less like a crowded barracks and more like a challenge she was determined to outlast. The next morning, one of the cadre sorted through data cards with the casual efficiency of someone who'd handled thousands. When he reached Mara's, his thumb hesitated. The edges were softened, worn the way field cards look after miles in a uniform pocket. Pencil marks overlapped like layers of history, not fresh guesses. It looked more like something carried overseas than something filled out in a classroom. He glanced at her quickly, then filed the card without a word. Later, while she tightened her gear before the next lane, her sleeve slipped up just enough to reveal a thin, healed line on her left wrist, the kind of mark that didn't beg for attention, because whatever story it told had already healed over. Specialist Evan Solis noticed it as he passed behind her, his eyes pausing a fraction too long before he looked away fast, embarrassed, like he'd accidentally read a page he wasn't meant to see. Mara didn't react. She pulled her sleeve back down and secured her strap with her usual practiced precision. The scar vanished again, leaving only the quiet suggestion that there was more beneath her uniform than the course could measure. During a quick break, she opened her ruck to grab a notebook, and something inside her ruck shifted. Tucked deep beneath spare socks and a folded poncho liner lay a small, worn patch. It wasn't bright or decorated with anything dramatic. It simply existed, pressed flat by time, kept close the way someone guards a private photograph they never show. When Mara noticed Solis nearby, she subtly angled her ruck so the patch stayed hidden. It wasn't secrecy out of shame but old habit, the kind formed when certain memories were meant to be carried quietly rather than explained. During the live fire brief, the air tightened again as weapons were cleared and checked, instructors calling out procedures with ritual precision. When one cadre member stumbled slightly over a safety phrase, just enough for a trained ear to catch, Mara murmured the correct wording under her breath, the exact phrasing a range safety NCO would use. Not loud, not showy, perfectly timed, meant only to prevent a mistake before it existed. Hartley's eyes flicked toward her, sharp and brief, then returned to the group. He didn't stop the brief or acknowledge her correction, but something subtle in his posture shifted, like a puzzle piece had clicked into place. Between lanes, two instructors stood close, talking low while pretending to study their notes. "Kincaid?" one muttered, eyes scanning the range. "Isn't she the one from 3rd Battalion?" The other shook his head. Different Kincaid, or maybe not. Their voices faded the moment Boots approached, conversation swallowed mid-thought. Mara walked past without slowing, not looking their way, not pretending she hadn't heard. She moved as if the words belonged to someone else entirely. That afternoon, during a short break meant for hydration and quick notes, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She'd forgotten it was even there. The signal was weak, unreliable, but the screen lit just enough to show a single missed voicemail, old timestamp, one she'd never deleted. She stepped a few paces away, using a vehicle door to shield herself, and unlocked the screen. The sender's name appeared, familiar enough to tighten her chest. She stared at it for a long second, thumb hovering over the play icon. Around her, the course kept moving. Times called out by instructors, steel ringing from another lane, a nervous laugh cutting off too quickly. Mara's breathing slowed, steadying as if bracing against an inward gust of wind. She didn't press play. Instead, she locked the screen and slid the phone back into her pocket, sealing the moment away as she always did. Whatever waited in that message belonged to another time, another version of her. The course didn't need to know it. She returned to the line with her face composed and her eyes forward. To anyone watching, she was just another candidate preparing for the next event. But the small clues around her were beginning to stack, ignored by most, unmistakable to a few. And somewhere between the worn edges of her data card and the voicemail she refused to replay, the outline of a deeper story waited. Quiet, patient, unfinished. The partner exercise was announced without ceremony, names read aloud like inventory. When Mara heard hers followed by Specialist Solis, she sensed his tension even before turning toward him. Solis swallowed hard, his eyes darting from her to the range and back again, hands twitching with small nervous motions he couldn't hide. Behind them, Rourke let out a short laugh that carried farther than he meant it to. "That's rough." he said to no one in particular, just loud enough. Guess she's getting dragged down by a weak link today. A couple of candidates gave uneasy half-smiles, unsure whether to join in or stay silent. Mara didn't respond. She met Solis's eyes and gave him a small, grounding nod. Not an order, just reassurance. He nodded back too quickly, caught somewhere between gratitude and fear. The stalk began under a field of watchful eyes. Instructors were spread across the terrain, spotters ready to call out every mistake. Almost immediately, Solis's breathing quickened. His movements became sharp and clumsy, elbows digging too deep, bending grass that should have stayed still. Mara raised one hand, her fingers forming a simple, undeniable signal. Stop. Solis froze, chest heaving, eyes wide. She waited patiently until his breathing slowed enough for him to hear the wind again. Her attention stayed on the terrain, as if the next move lived in the ground itself. Leaning close enough for him to hear, she whispered without raising her voice. No lecture, no scolding. She guided him inch by inch, showing him when to move, when to wait, how to sync with the instructor's scan pattern instead of fighting it. They advanced only when the range felt ready for them, never when fear urged them forward. Each pause stretched longer than it felt. Sweat cooled on their backs. Somewhere nearby, another candidate was spotted and pulled from the lane, his failure echoing across the field like a warning shot. Mara didn't rush. She gave the moment room until Solis's panic loosened its grip and turned into focus. When they reached the firing position, Solis's hands trembled as he set up. The rifle felt heavier now, success suddenly possible, failure suddenly louder. His breathing slipped into shallow, shaky patterns that shattered precision. Mara didn't take the rifle. She didn't adjust his scope or push him aside. She stayed close, voice calm, steady enough to borrow. Breathe, she murmured, waiting for his shoulders to drop. Settle, she added, watching his reticle steady. After a beat earned through control, she said, Press. The shot broke clean. Steel rang downrange, a crisp, undeniable sound that sliced through the tension. No one cheered. The spotter called the hit, flat and official, but heads still turned. Solis blinked, stunned, then looked at Mara with pure relief. She gave him a small nod. Nothing more. The moment belonged to him. When her turn came, Mara moved with the same composed rhythm she'd carried all day. She settled into position, checked her natural point of aim, and studied the mirage like it was retelling a story she already understood. The wind shifted, subtle but clear, and she adjusted without a flicker of drama. Her round struck steel on the very first shot. No correction, no hesitation. She didn't react, didn't soak in the moment. She simply called out the wind shift for the next shooter as calmly as if she were checking the time. Trying to pull the attention back toward himself, Rourke let out an irritated scoff behind the line. Lucky day, he muttered, forcing the words into the open, eager to shrink her performance into something easy to dismiss. Mara didn't turn. She didn't raise her voice. Luck doesn't hold a rifle steady, she said, tone flat. Neither cruel nor bragging, just undeniable. The words landed heavier than any argument. For a heartbeat, the whole range seemed to hold still, the atmosphere tightening like the air pressure had shifted. Master Sergeant Hartley stepped closer, scanning Mara's data, then her rifle, then the mirage rolling downrange. He knelt and traced through her dope with a finger deliberate enough to show he wasn't missing a single detail. "Where'd you learn to read mirage like that?" he asked. No accusation, no praise, Just the kind of curiosity professionals show when something doesn't fit the usual pattern. Mara paused, the slightest hesitation slipping across her expression like a door she considered opening before letting it shut. "From mistakes," she said quietly. Hartley studied her for a moment longer, then rose and moved on, saying nothing more. But the shift had already begun. The way people looked at her changed. The jokes that once circled her name suddenly had no air left in them. Conversations dipped when she walked past. By the next rotation, the rumor had flipped completely. No one whispered about her failing again. Instead, they asked, carefully, almost afraid of the answer, "Why does she move like someone who's done this when it mattered?" The laughter that used to chase her faded out. Even Rourke, the loudest of them, started watching his words, measuring them as cautiously as he measured wind calls. Respect didn't come all at once. It crept in quietly, replacing cocky certainty with uneasy curiosity. Mara sensed it, but she didn't nurture it or lean into it. She simply kept her focus where it had always belonged. She kept her attention exactly where it needed to be, on the rifle, on the terrain, on whatever task waited next. Whatever the others were beginning to sense about her, she wasn't ready to give it shape. Not yet. The graded unknown distance evaluation pulled a different kind of energy across the range. Word spread fast when a senior leader arrived, his boots hitting the gravel with a weight that made spines straighten on instinct. Command Sergeant Major Marcus Devereaux stepped onto the line with the quiet authority of someone who had earned every bit of his reputation through deployments, the kind of leader whose history didn't need a single introduction. Everything about him looked old school, uniform plain and worn in the right places, movements intentional, eyes sharp but patient. The cadre shifted without being told, giving him space, and the candidates felt the atmosphere tighten. This wasn't a show and shine inspection. This was someone who understood exactly what this course tried to measure. Devereaux walked the line slowly, stopping now and then to study a shooter's setup or posture. He spoke rarely, letting silence handle most of the work. When he reached Mara, his eyes settled on her name tape before lifting to her face. Something in his expression changed. A flicker, like a memory stepping forward unannounced. For the first time since the course began, someone looked at her as if she were more than a roster number. He held her gaze a moment longer than protocol demanded. The noise around them seemed to dim, conversations softening as if people felt the shift without knowing why. "Kincaid," he said quietly, his voice carrying weight without needing volume. "Were you in Warden Province for the winter rotation 6 years ago?" The question landed exactly where the quiet clues of her story had been pointing. Mara didn't look around to see who was listening. She didn't brace herself. She simply met his eyes and answered, "Yes, Sergeant Major." Devereaux's posture changed, not dramatically, not in any way meant to draw attention, but unmistakably to anyone who understood the language of rank. His shoulders eased, his expression softened from evaluation into something closer to respect. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only a few nearby could hear. "You were the one who stayed on glass after your team leader went down," he said. Not a question. Memory put into words. Mara didn't correct him. She didn't explain, didn't share the burden or deflect the credit. She just gave a small, controlled nod, acknowledging the truth without trying to own it. Around them, the range had gone still in a way unrelated to command presence. Competition noise evaporated. No jokes, no whispers. Even Rourke stood frozen, staring downrange like he suddenly realized he'd been standing too close to something he didn't understand. Devereaux straightened, offering Mara a final look packed with years of recognition compressed into a second. Then he moved on, boots crunching softly as the course resumed, but the silence he left behind stayed, heavy with understanding. Nothing about the day felt the same after that. The range settled into a quieter kind of silence, one that didn't come from command, but from realization. The candidates who had mocked her earlier no longer met her eyes, not out of fear, but because something heavier had taken the place of their easy confidence. Shame lingered in small gestures. Heads dipped, conversations faltered, steps slowed when she walked by. Specialist Solis looked at her differently now. It wasn't awe, it was understanding. He finally saw that her calm wasn't a personality quirk or some clever trick. It was earned, shaped under pressure long before this course tried to measure it. Without noticing, he straightened his posture, mirroring the discipline he had watched in her from the beginning. Even Rourke fell quiet. He didn't apologize. He didn't say anything. His certainty had folded in on itself, leaving him unsure of his footing for the first time. When the final evaluation was announced, the hush held steady. Unknown distant steel sat far downrange, targets scattered with deliberate cruelty, built to punish guesswork and reward patience. The wind shifted just enough to lie to anyone in a hurry. The time limit pressed close. Ammunition was limited. There would be no second chances. Mara moved into position without rushing. She laid out her gear with the same practiced precision as always, each item placed with purpose. She checked her natural point of aim, then checked it again. She studied the mirage through her optic, not chasing perfect certainty, but listening for the consistent patterns around her. Others fidgeted, adjusted repeatedly, whispered numbers like quiet prayers. Mara stayed still. She built her firing solution piece by piece, letting the range speak before she answered. When her turn came, only the farthest target remained. The cadre called it the Reach, a distance notorious for ending more careers than it crowned. The steel looked tiny and merciless against the land. Heat shimmer warped its edges, and the wind bent the truth between shooter and target. Mara didn't rush. She watched the mirage roll left, then soften. She felt the faint tug of the wind brushing through the grass against her cheek. She made one adjustment, a small one, the kind that came from experience rather than raw calculation. Her breathing slowed. The world shrank to reticle and rhythm, and she pressed the trigger the same way she had pressed it when precision meant survival, not a score. The steel rang late, not a sharp crack, not immediate, but arriving a heartbeat after her shot, clean and unmistakable, carrying across the range like a quiet verdict. For a moment, no one said a word. A cadre member checked the scoreboard, frowned, checked it again. He scribbled something down, hesitated, then looked up. New course record. No cheering followed. No one shouted her name. The moment wasn't built for noise. It settled over the range, heavy and reverent, as if sound itself didn't belong there. Command Sergeant Major Marcus Devereaux lifted his hand and gave her a single salute, brief, precise, and heavier with meaning than applause could ever be. Master Sergeant Logan Hartley followed with a short, deliberate nod, the kind reserved for respect already earned. The range stayed quiet, and in that silence, Mara Kincaid remained exactly who she had been from the start. When the line finally cleared and the space began to exhale, Rourke waited until everyone else had drifted away. He approached without his usual volume, hands loose, swagger gone. "I was wrong," he said. "No excuses, no story to soften the blow, just the truth. plain and unpolished. Mara looked at him a moment, not to decide whether to forgive, but to measure whether the moment would matter. "Make it useful," she said evenly. "Teach the next person better than you treated me." Rourke nodded once, harder than necessary, like the words hit exactly where they should. Then he stepped away, quieter than he'd ever been. Later, away from the range and from every watching eye, Mara sat on the edge of her bunk, dust still clinging to her sleeves. She pulled out her phone, unlocked it, and let her thumb hover over the same frozen spot as before. This time she pressed play. The voice that filled the room was gentle, worn, achingly familiar. It belonged to her former team leader, her spouse. There was no dramatics, only gratitude shaped by loss and memory. She thanked Mara for staying with him that night, for holding the line, for bringing him home alive even though the injuries had ended his career. She said their children still asked about the soldier who never left his side. Mara didn't move. Her eyes filled quietly, the way they always did when grief slipped in without warning. She wiped them away fast, not from embarrassment, but from habit. Soldiers learn early that sorrow waits in the corners, patient and never loud. She locked the phone again and sat still for a long moment, letting the memory settle in her chest without letting it spill. Courage isn't loud. It doesn't shout for attention or wait for an audience. Discipline rarely looks impressive while it's happening, and humility never needs to raise its voice. Most of the time, real strength moves quietly, fixing small errors, choosing patience over pride, returning to places that once pushed you out. Some people come back for payback. Others return to prove something. But the strongest return because they're needed, because readiness matters more than recognition, because unfinished work doesn't vanish just because it once caused pain. Mara Kincaid didn't leave the range that day changed by applause or records. She walked away exactly as she'd arrived, carrying responsibility forward, leaving trophies for others to chase. The course had measured distance and wind, but what it revealed was something older, harder to teach. Respect should come before the record ever does. Mara folded her data book with the same steady care she'd shown all week and slipped it into her pocket without ceremony. She left the range with an even stride, shoulders steady, posture untouched by praise or performance. To anyone watching from afar, she looked just like she had that first morning, quiet, grounded, ready to get back to work. Stories like hers remind us how often strength hides behind silence. The person you dismissed today, the one underestimated, overlooked, pushed aside, may be the one who holds the team steady when pressure closes in and there's no room left for noise. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to Old Bill's Tales for more true military and veteran stories. These stories keep courage alive for generations.